Good evening, everyone. Now, as a high school teacher, I work with 15-year-olds every day. Now, to some of you, that might be your worst nightmare. I mean, we've all been 15-year-olds, and I bet that you must remember a time when you or you know someone that gave your teachers a hard time. And even on reflection, myself, I remember being kicked out of class because I was talking too much and I had my flip phone confiscated. I guess that's really showing my age. Yes, 15-year-olds have a knack for making your blood boil. And if you let your guard down, they can cause grief and havoc in the classroom. And yes, I know that. That's my day job. That's what I signed up for. But what I did not sign up for, and what I did not anticipate, was for a 15-year-old to be the cause of the greatest grief and havoc in my life. Now, on October 2nd, 2015, a 15-year-old boy was pacing back and forth outside the New South Wales Police headquarters in Parramatta, Sydney. He had a gun in his hand, and he was looking for a target. Now, Dad walked out at the right place at the right time, and this 15-year-old boy followed him. He pulled out his gun and shot him in the back of the head at point-blank range. The shot killed Dad instantly. Farhad Jabbar knew nothing of the person that walked out of the building, not his name nor age, that he was a loving father and devoted husband, that he was a Buddhist, a dancer, a jokester. He did not know that he was not a police officer. But in that moment, our worlds have collided. I just didn't know it yet. And at that same moment, I was walking into a restaurant in the McLaren Vale in South Australia, and a friend got an alert on his phone, and he was like, "Oh, there's been a shooting outside the New South Wales Police headquarters in Parramatta." And I shrugged it off and said, "Oh, well, Dad works there. Maybe I should give him a call." But we sat down and we ordered, and I gave Dad a call. It didn't connect. Odd. So curious, I just called home. And Mum picked up, and she was worried as well. Dad hadn't come home yet, and she too could not connect. I just reassured her that it must be a security measure, that no one can leave and they can't make any connections. But shortly after, I got a call from my sister, and she was in tears on the phone, and I knew before she even spoke. Did you hear what happened outside the New South Wales Police headquarters? The police just notified me that that was Dad. And in that moment, the world as I know it has shattered. Now, sudden grief is hard to deal with at the best of time. But public grief gives you little solace. And the past 18 months has been one of the toughest times of my life. And little did I know it, I went through an intense learning experience to cope with a new reality and a new role. It has taken me out of the classroom and onto a much wider stage. And since then, I have spoken and written widely about the need for a safer and more inclusive society. It has taken me from showing TED Talks in the classroom to being in one. But what's most confusing is that my students seem to pay more attention to me when I'm on screen than when I'm there in real life. It just shows what complementary lighting and sound system does to your credibility. And now with all the credibility surrounding me, I hope to share with you some lessons that I've learnt in the past 18 months. And I hope that they are relevant to you, whether you're 15 or 50. Whether, like yourselves, you've chosen to be in my lesson, or if you're in the back of the room and you think, I'm a big pain because I'm not letting you out to lunch before you learn something. So here goes. Lesson number 1. The hate stops with me, and the hate stops with you. Now, I have every right to be hateful and angry. At that time, sorry. I remember when I was a recent migrant. I'll just start with that story. A recent migrant in Australia. And I remember that I was being bullied for being Asian, for being an immigrant, and people made deportation jokes. And Dad, and I remember being really angry and upset. But I remember the lesson Dad told me, that to overcome this, we must do this with patience, hard work, and resilience. Now, hate is a destructive emotion to hold on to. And hate and anger will only lead to more hate and anger. That is what the extremists would want me to feel. And I choose not to feel that, and I choose to not give them more fuel. Because to hate is a choice, but to not hate is also a choice, and we must rise above that. And that leads me to lesson number 2. Is that an injustice should not lead to another. Now, it is really easy to point fingers. It's Muslim. It's poor surveillance. It's political correctness gone mad. It's the dishonest media. Now, at my father's funeral, in my eulogy, I had an open national stage, and I could have blamed anyone that I wanted. But I knew one thing for certain, is that I did not want Dad's tragedy to be a call to arms, to fuel hate and fear. And that guiding principle has led me to speak out against One Nation Senator Pauline Hanson, and most recently, US President Donald Trump, both of whom have used Dad's tragedy to simplistically scapegoat a particular group of people, Muslims. Now, I am all for discussions, actions, and decisions that address the drivers of extremism. But what I will not stand for is rhetoric that seeks to divide and victimize a particular group of people just for who they are. Whilst we must respond to sudden changes, sometimes dramatic changes, an injustice should not fuel another. And that leads me to lesson number 3. The action of one does not equal an action of a group. Now, it is a well-known fact that the assailant that killed my father was a Muslim, was visiting a mosque in Parramatta, and was influenced by ISIS propaganda. We cannot refute that. But what is less well known is that one of my best friends is from a Muslim background. And I cannot see the linkage between the 15-year-old boy that shot my father in the back of the head to one of my best friends who took time off work, who dropped everything to be with me in my darkest days. Yes, we cannot deny that an extreme form of the faith was a contributing factor, but we cannot paint a broad brush. The action of one does not equal an entire group. Which leads me to my next lesson, is that we must call out the act and not the faith. Because if we call out the act, we are able to address that. But if we call out the faith, it muddies the waters. Now, hate is not bred by faith. Hate preachers and fanatics pull out scriptures, doctrines, and traditions in order to meet their own ends. And we've seen that in terms of justifying acts of violence, the violation of human rights, human decency and equality, and murder. Now, we must call out the act and not the faith. That's not being politically correct. I think that's just being correct. Now, you might think this is logical. But if you think that, then I'm probably not speaking to you. I'm trying to reach out, if this was a lesson, to the student that's in the back of the room with their arms crossed and their hoodies over their head looking at their feet. The one that doesn't want to have their perspective understanding changed. Which leads me to my next lesson. That it's hard to change attitudes. And I know that in the classroom. Just 2 weeks ago, I was teaching a lesson on identity and culture. And we talked about the dangers of prejudice, the dangers of fear-mongering and scapegoating. And at the end of the lesson, I asked my students to write down on a sheet of paper what they believe that they can take away from and what they needed to do to contribute to a more inclusive and safer society. Now, a lot of the students wrote down what we've just talked about. They wrote down that the hate stops with me. They wrote down an injustice should not fuel another, and that the action of one does not equal an entire group. Now, I had one anonymous note back, and it said, kick all the Muslims out. Now, this was not a joke, and this was said with all intent and seriousness. And after all we've talked about, but I cannot blame this student. There are a whole host of reasons why someone has anger and resentment in that way. And as an educator, we cannot give up in providing understanding and perspective, because sometimes the most rewarding part of being a teacher, an educator, is not when your best and brightest students understand something straight away. It's perhaps that one defiant student, and over a period of time, shows an inkling of change. And that is how we need to approach our discourse. But our next lesson, and we all must remember that complex issues need complex solutions. And extremism is a complex issue. There is no silver bullet. But the problem is that the ones that seem to know the least about the issue are the most desperate to find that silver bullet. Now, at the end of 2016, I was invited to a counter-extremism hackathon, where it's an intensive group problem-solving workshop to try to find a solution to online extremism. And in my team, I had IT experts, graphics designers, counterterrorism researchers, myself, someone who's experienced extremism, but most interestingly, a former extremist. For 3 days, I worked in the same group and sat next to a former white supremacist who used to bash up Asians, Chinese. How's that for confronting? He's now a friend. What I've learnt is that ideas may come from unlikely perspectives. Now, my new friend works in the juvenile justice system, working with young people who are on the path or at risk of being on the path of violence and extremism. And he coaches them out of it through his own experiences and realization. What he also taught me was that the drivers of extremism and violence and hateful attitudes are individual, personal, fueled by anger and resentment that is usually unrelated to what they're projecting against. Now, no war will solve that. No immigration ban, no deportation scheme. There is no silver bullet. There's no silver bullet, no one single solution for our societal challenges. Now, our law enforcement know that, and our schools know that. Now, if only 15-year-old Farhad Jabbar, the boy that shot my father, knew that. Now, I wish that I could stand here and tell you what the solutions are, because lots of people have asked me, Alpha, what do you think are the causes of extremism? What do you think is the solution? And I really have to say, I alone do not have the answer. And no single person does. But there are a lot of people that do. On the ground, there are counter-terrorism experts, law enforcement, community leaders, community workers, social workers, youth workers. And some people are working every day to address the drivers of extremism and violence in our society. And we must start listening to those people. and not to those that seek to address this with headlines. Because we must all work together. And this all must sound kind of bleak, but what gives me hope is the belief and the understanding that there is humanity in all of us, that all of us are capable of respect, love, and compassion. Now, a 15-year-old was the cause of the greatest grief and havoc in my life, and it took a 15-year-old to realize that the challenge ahead is tough. But it is also my students, teenagers, 15-year-olds, that have also been the greatest source of inspiration in the past 18 months. So I cannot paint a broad brush. I remember going back to work after taking a couple of weeks off after Dad's funeral. And in the first lesson, I told my story and I asked if the students had any questions for me. Unexpectedly, from the back of the room, I had a hand up. Not your usual suspect. But he said, "Mr. Cheng, I have a question. What do you need from us to help you get through this difficult time?" I was not expecting that. I was not expecting the depth of compassion and empathy that was coming out of the room. And for the next 18 months, I've been constantly surprised. And there was one time when a student slipped me a note. And on the note, it said, "Mr. Cheng, this quote helped me get through some hard times, and I hope it helps you too." The quote read, "You do not know how strong you are until being strong is the only choice you have." And that continues to give me strength and the hope for the future, which leads me to my final lesson, is that humanity is greater and safer when we are the sum of the best that we bring out of each other. Now, there are tough times ahead, attitudes that are hard to shift, and we continue to see acts of violence that hurt us, and we continue to hear words that divide us, and we cannot approach this with division and fear. We must approach this with unity and courage and inclusion. And my challenge is to you all, what will you do? What can we do to bring out the best in all of us? In your families, in your communities, in your schools, in your society. Because humanity is greater and safer when we are the sum of the best that we draw out from each other. And that is my hope, and I hope you can share it. Thank you.